Well, Bill, it's good to be in Florida. Good that you decided to do this video with us, so thank you so much, and I'm sure the audience appreciates hearing some words of wisdom from you.
Well, thanks, Phil. Given the difficulties I've had traveling the last few years, I so appreciate CCAR working out a way for me to participate in what I think will be a very historic conference. So,
yeah, it's all about the multiple pathways, so should we get right into it?
Where do you want to start?
Well, I gotta put my glasses on so I can see these questions. So please talk about your epiphany in Dallas and how that shaped your work in the years to come.
You know, I've talked about that on occasions. The context for that was having worked in the field at that point for some almost 30 years and had worked in treatment, gone back to school, really worked hard to learn about addiction and treatment. So then I go to Dallas and I'm going in to speak at a professional conference. I arrive early because I want to interview some old timers about the early treatment, the early history of AA and its relationship to treatment in the Southwest. So I get some of these old timers around me, and I'm interviewing them about this early fascinating history. And we take a break, and CCW, one of the old timers, who at that point had more than 50 years of continuous recovery, says to me, "Now, Bill, what is this research stuff you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm part of this research institute, and we're beginning to follow people after treatment, and I'm very excited because we've just got a new study funded that's going to allow us to follow people for 5 years." And Circe looks at me with this funny smile on his face, and he says, 5 years, very impressive. And then he says, "What does your research tell you about characters like us?" And he points to these other old timers around him. And I had to look at him and say, you know, from the standpoint of the profession and the science of our field, we don't even know you exist. And then he kind of smiled, and we went back to the regular interview. And on my flight home that night, I was almost haunted by his question. And I kept having this feeling that, you know, as a field, we can fill whole libraries about what we know about addiction, and we can fill whole libraries about what we know about treatment. But I'm wondering if we could fill a shelf about what we really know about the solution to these problems in terms of our knowledge of long-term recovery for individuals and families. And I sort of, as I've reflected on that, I had this kind of awakening to say, you know, whatever time I have left in the field, I really want to devote that time to the study of solutions. And in particular, I want to study the prevalence and pathways and styles and stages of long-term recovery. And that was really the beginning of this whole shift towards a kind of a recovery paradigm from a treatment and intervention paradigm for me within the field. And all the subsequent work really emerged out of that kind of awakened experience in Dallas.
That's very cool. That was, what, 30 years ago, you said? Or
It was in the late 90s. Yeah, it was in the late 90s.
Yeah.
So this is, you know, if we're talking all the work in the years since has really been based on that.
Bill, we know that there are many definitions of recovery floating around out there. What definition of recovery suits you most?
You know, I think the most important starting point for me is to make the distinction between remission and recovery. Remission is a medical term. It's how we measure outcomes scientifically, and it basically means how many people have met lifetime criteria for a substance use disorder but haven't met that criteria in the past 12 months. So when you see most of the recovery data that's reported is actually really remission data. Now, when you talk about recovery the way it's talked about in recovery advocacy settings, in peer recovery support settings, we almost universally say that recovery is far more than just the removal of alcohol and drugs from an otherwise unchanged life. So there's a growing consensus that recovery really involves 3 core components. And that is a fundamental reconstruction of the person-drug relationship. And that usually occurs in 2 forms, with lower problem severity substance use disorders we may see the moderated resolution of those problems. As problems become more severe and complex and prolonged, we generally see abstinence-based resolution or reconstruction of that relationship. But in both cases, we see a radical change in the person-drug relationship towards more healthy, more positive, less destructive patterns. And then the second component is that we see an increase in what we call global health. And by global health, we really mean enhancements in emotional health, physical health, relational health, and occupational health. And then the third component is really a change in the relationship between person and community. And in the Betty Ford Institute definitional work that we did back in 2007, they simply refer to that as citizenship, a shift from a destructive person-community relationship to a much more positive, contributing person-community relationship. So in summary, we know a lot about remission, but we've yet to do formal studies of recovery that really incorporate those three core definitional elements of change in the person-drug relationship, enhancements of global health, and change in the person-community relationship.
Bill, what data best illustrates the point about remission/recovery prevalence?
As I mentioned, we don't have the comprehensive recovery prevalence studies, but we do have a growing number of very sophisticated national studies on remission. And in those multiple studies, the percentage of the population that we find that once met lifetime criteria for a substance use disorder, but no longer meets that disorder in the past 12 months, ranges between 5 and 15% of U.S. adult citizens. So that gives us a range between 25 and 40 million adults in remission from a substance use disorder. Now that doesn't include adolescents, it doesn't include individuals who are in recovery for the past year, and it also doesn't include within that figure individuals who are in remission from nicotine dependence. So when you hear the 23 to 25 million estimate right now of people in recovery, it's really based on that remission data.
In the CCAR Recovery Coach Academy, there is an entire module on the distinction between pathways to recovery and pathways of recovery. What would you like the audience to know about this distinction?
We have this kind of iconic three-part recovery story that dates all the way back to the Washingtonians of the 1840s and before, of what it was like during addiction, what happened, and what is it like now. The Pathways To story really encompasses a great deal of the destruction and debris left from one's active addiction. And even when you hear recovery stories, a large part of that story really focuses on the active addiction. But when you talk about pathways of recovery, the focus shifts from the addiction story really to the recovery story. And that really gets into the how recovery was achieved, how it was initiated, and how it was maintained. So I like the shift from pathways to pathways of as a way to really dramatize this increased recovery orientation.
What you were talking about was what I learned in my recovery was this idea of what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now.
Exactly.
And now we're really focusing on what we are like now in that pathway of recovery and how we got there.
Exactly.
Bill, we use the term recovery a lot. In recovery from what?
Phil, that's an important question. When the Betty Ford Consensus Panel met in 2007 to try to come up with a recovery definition that could guide clinicians and researchers, that was a point we made repeatedly, that recovery has meaning only in the context of recovery from a disorder. And by that we meant that the term really needs to apply to individuals who met diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder. Now, we have all kinds of people that experience alcohol and other drug problems of a transient nature, what we might call subclinical problems. that don't meet that diagnostic criteria in terms of intensity or duration of the problems resulting from it. But probably terms like quit or resolve or moderate or control probably are more applicable to those patterns than is the term recovery, which we like to restrict to the more severe, complex, and more enduring, and the resolution of those over time.
Would you say there are differences in pathways and styles across certain populations? And if there are, could you describe them for us?
You know, I wish I could describe them in more detail, Phil. We've done a tremendous amount of research on how do things like gender, how do things like age, how do things like co-occurring disorders, medical or psychiatric, how do alcohol and other drug problems differ within different cultural contexts? But when we shift that to recovery and ask the questions, are there different styles or patterns of recovery for women than men? Are there differences of recovery when onset is it 15 years of age as opposed to 45 or 55 or 75? Is there differences based on, are there different patterns we find of recovery within the LGBT community? Do we have differences of recovery for people with co-occurring disorders, et cetera? We're just beginning to map those out. And so far, I think the preliminary answers we have are yes, there seem to be significant differences across those, but our answers to those are very tentative. And what that, I think, calls for is a very high degree of humility, that when we talk about what we know about recovery, we must be very specific in terms of what our experience is based on to date, and keep those ideas on probation, because they may differ as we apply them to different subpopulations and different cultural communities.
How does the factor of trauma play into this?
It's in that same context. We know that trauma can have a significant effect on increasing vulnerability for substance use disorders. But we also find that there are differences across traumatized population, whether we're talking about historical trauma or developmental trauma. And for example, in the area of developmental trauma, we know people are at significantly elevated risk if they're based on unique characteristics of that trauma, meaning the intensity, the types of trauma experienced, the duration of it, who the particular perpetrators were and the relationship to the perpetrators, what happened if the person disclosed or shared the story of that trauma, and then what the response was to that disclosure. Those are examples of things that shift in terms of vulnerability. What we're not sure of is we haven't done the studies to know how does recovery differ when you're also recovering from trauma in addition to recovering from an addictive disorder. And this, as we've begun to look at this, it really has raised the question for us about this issue of what we've called concurrent recovery or sequential or serial recovery, meaning people that are recovering from multiple conditions doing so at the same time, meaning they're having to adjust and manage multiple recovery experiences at the same time, such as recovery from addiction and recovery in terms of HIV or AIDS, or recovery from trauma, or recovery from depression at the same time. Or some individuals who in their recovery experience may almost have to sequence, where there's a focus on one particular dimension of recovery that then may shift to another dimension of recovery over time. Meaning that my first initial focus may be on stabilizing the addiction, but once that's stabilized, the next layer of that onion may be the trauma that sat underneath that addiction.
Bill, in your writing, you introduced the concept of recovery rubrics. What are these, and how do they help us look at multiple pathways of recovery?
We've described, Phil, three such rubrics, and the first one is really reflects the very long historical focus on recovery for the individual. But as we got into the 1970s and 1980s, we began to have a number of professionals and family members in recovery really begin to crystallize this concept of family recovery, based on the idea that the family as well as the individual is deeply wounded by the addiction experience. And that means that every individual in the family is affected by addiction. The family subsystems are injured and wounded by addiction. And by subsystems, I mean the adult intimate relationship, the parent-child relationship, the sibling relationships, such that as we then transition from active addiction and the adjustments that family has made to that state, that virtually everything then has to get reconstructed in the family recovery process. So we began to describe this larger healing process of families as family recovery. And some of the research was very important here. I particularly commend the work of Stephanie Brown, because I think we'd assumed clinically from those of us working in addiction treatment that if we could just get the addicted individual into a stable process of recovery, that much of the dysfunction and harm to the family would naturally resolve itself with continued sobriety. When in fact what Stephanie Brown found when she began to study families was that recovery can actually be very destabilizing to family systems. And that if families don't have what she called scaffolding, these built-in supports, which can come from extended family members or Al-Anon or professional treatment or peer recovery support from other family, that families can actually disintegrate during recovery, and those same families have absorbed every insult addiction had to offer, but only found themselves falling apart in the early processes of recovery. So I think we've learned a lot, begun to learn a lot about family recovery, and are now just beginning to mine all of the implications of that. The third rubric is a very recent one, and I really commend the work, the collaborations I've done with Arthur Evans and Roland Lamb and others from Philadelphia. But in our work there, we began to step back a bit and realize that there are whole communities that have been severely wounded by alcohol and other drug problems, and that those whole communities might need a recovery process themselves. So we've begun to talk about this concept of community recovery, or the idea of the community as patient, and talking about community level processes to facilitate that recovery.
Bill, how do recovery rubrics relate to recovery capital?
Good question, Phil. The recovery capital concept was developed by Granfield and Cloud in their studies of natural recovery. And they define recovery capital as the internal and external assets that allow somebody to initiate and maintain long-term recovery from addiction. So when we think about these rubrics, we can talk about personal recovery capital in various dimensions. We can talk about how do we increase recovery capital for families, and how do we increase recovery capitals for whole communities. And at a community level, for example, one of the things in our work in Philadelphia we tried to do was look at how do we conceptualize recovery capital at a community level, and how does recovery capital relate to problems experienced in that same community. So one of the things we did was a process called recovery resource mapping, where we began to look at problem data related to alcohol and drug problems in the city of Philadelphia by census tract. And then we began to look at the placement of recovery support resources. And that was everything from where are treatment centers located, where are the recovery houses located, where are the recovery community centers located, where are recovery mutual aid meetings being hosted, and matched the problems with the problems with where we had recovery capital resources. And that allowed us to identify areas that had high problem severity, but were very vacant in terms of recovery capital. And it allowed us to target resources within that. So I sort of commend that process of recovery resource mapping, which could be done at a city or a county or even a statewide level.
Bill, what impact does motivation have on the recovery process? And are we looking at the role of motivation differently now?
You know, we have, Phil. For most of my early career, I think professionally the way we looked at it, and also in recovery mutual aid context, the way we tended to look at it was that recovery initiation was really about a pain quotient. And the idea was when pain and consequences of addiction got severe enough and prolonged enough that we would spark this existential crisis we referred to as hitting bottom, and that recovery came out of that process of pain. But what began to change that was a number of things, and one of them were, at a personal level, my encounters with individuals working with very culturally disempowered individuals. For example, I was working with outreach workers, working primarily with African American women in recovery in the child welfare system. And I would try to make sense out of the recoveries of women who had massive odds against such recovery. And I kept listening and waiting for this hit bottom, painful crisis moment. And finally the outreach workers kind of got in my face and said, "Bill, you don't get it. My clients don't hit bottom, they live on the bottom. Bottom is the norm for them. If we wait for them to hit bottom, they will die." The issue was not an absence of pain in their lives. The issue was an absence of hope. And that was sort of an aha moment for me personally. And I think as a field we've made that same shift, that there are push forces related to pain and consequences, but that there can also be pull forces. And the pull forces really involve things like hope. It involves exposure to other people who have something that I want and that I'm drawn towards. And that really comes from the experience of meeting and listening to the stories of other people in recovery. And as we've come to shift that notion that there are pull forces in addition to push forces, we've also begun to think about this whole idea of that recovery can be contagious. And it's particularly contagious when people are exposed to people we've called recovery carriers. And these are individuals and family members in recovery who, based on how they conduct themselves and how the nature of their character, really draw people to recovery almost in spite of themselves. Meaning that people get caught up in recovery before and actually enter recovery before they consciously choose recovery based on experience of contact with these individuals. And that's led us in turn to say, well, at a community level, how would we affect motivation for recovery in a whole community that's adversely affected by alcohol and drug problems? And our answer is to strategically increase the number or density of recovery carriers within that community by peer leadership development within recovery communities within that setting.
I love that whole idea of recovery being contagious and the whole idea of recovery carriers. That just resonates in my heart, and I know that's what my personal life is about, so thank you for sharing that. You're talking about recovery, and I have to ask you, does recovery happen quickly over a period of time? Are there stages of recovery?
You know, as we look at varieties of recovery experience or multiple pathways of recovery, I think there are two sort of temporal frameworks for recovery. We have all kinds of staged models of recovery, from Prochaska and DiClemente's trans-theoretical model of change to all kinds of other models. And in my own research, I've conceptualized the stages of recovery for many people as going from a stage of what I call pre-covery, which is a concept that out of my own experience that says many people initiate recovery, in many cases long before they cease alcohol and other drug use. And this is a period of sort of recovery incubation, enhanced recovery readiness, increased ambiguity about the person-drug relationship, kind of a yearning. It sets the stage for this existential crisis to move into recovery. And then a stage of recovery initiation, a transition from recovery initiation and stabilization to longer-term recovery maintenance. And then a fourth stage of moving towards a focus on enhanced quality of personal and family life and long-term recovery. And then I think a neglected stage, which is really increased awareness of the risk of intergenerational transmission of alcohol and other drug problems. and some real focus in our own families to try to break those intergenerational cycles. Now all of these staged models really are based on the idea that recovery is a time-dependent process, that you sort of have to get through one stage before you can sort of move and stabilize the next stage. But there's also an alternative way that recovery is done for some individuals. And this is called transformational change, or what Bill Miller in his research called quantum change. And this is recovery is almost like a conversion experience. It's a change experience that happens in a moment that can forever cleave one's life into the categories of before and after. And these are experiences that are unplanned. They're profound in terms of the vividness of their experience, and at times almost experienced as a kind of near insanity experience. They're so disorganizing. They also tend to be positive, and they tend to be permanent. And if we look at some of the iconic recovery leaders in history, from Handsome Lake through Jerry McAuley in the 19th century, through Malcolm X and Bill Wilson in the 20th century, we find that individuals who've had these catalytic, sudden recovery conversion experiences often went on into leadership positions and launched major recovery support movements. So in summary, we really have two styles time-wise, and that's a stage-dependent process and this dramatically condensed, almost spiritual conversion experience as a recovery initiation process.
As odd as this question sounds, Bill, do you think it's possible for people to have different levels of recovery?
You know, when Ernie Kurtz and I were first working on a paper on varieties of recovery experience, that's one of the questions we looked at. Are there sort of levels or depths of recovery? Because what we kept encountering was, if we say that recovery has three components, there are some people that we could say have experienced full recovery in the sense that we can find evidence of change in all three of those dimensions of the person-drug relationship, enhancements of emotional, physical health, and this person-community relationship. But then we find other people where we find they've radically altered the person-drug relationship. They've maintained continuous sobriety, maybe for decades. But when we look at other areas, what we find is potentially virtually no change in the other two dimensions. So in that case, and some people in recovery circles have referred to that as dry drunk, or people needing emotional sobriety and other such caricatures. The key thing is that if recovery involves multiple dimensions, there is a concept of partial recovery that says people may achieve one of those dimensions at a very high level, but still have major work to do or problems existing in those other areas. Now, this is an interesting way to contrast recovery in the mental health context to recovery from the addiction concept. Because in the mental health field, historically, they've had a very clear concept of partial recovery from things like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. But they've had, until very recently, no concept of full recovery from those same disorders. By contrast, in the addiction field, we've had a reified concept of full recovery, but we haven't had a legitimized concept of partial recovery. And that's something, as time goes on, that we may need to talk about and tease out and nuance both our language and our understanding. There's also a third level that we encountered. In addition to full recovery and partial recovery, as Ernie and I continued our research into this, we found a significant subset of people who not only get well from addiction, but they get better than well. And this is what we called an amplified state of addiction recovery, in which persons achieve an extremely elevated level of personal and interpersonal functioning and contributions to the larger recovery. And not only have we not told the recovery story at a community level or a cultural level, but most importantly, we haven't talked about the major contributions that come to this culture from individuals who've achieved this amplified depth of recovery.
In my limited research on this subject, there seem to be different categories that pathways of recovery fall into. I believe you call them organizing frameworks. Could you talk about this?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. As we look at the how people make sense of their recovery, or the kind of ideas and rituals and values they use to drive the recovery experience, we generally find three categories of those. We have explicitly secular pathways of addiction recovery. We have explicitly religious pathways and non-religious spiritual pathways of recovery. And as you can see nationally in the United States at present, we have our recovery mutual aid organizations that fall clearly into those categories. In terms of the explicitly secular groups, we have groups like Women for Sobriety and secular organizations for sobriety and Smart Recovery and Life-Ring Secular Recovery. In terms of our explicitly religious groups, we have historically groups like Alcoholics Victorious, Alcoholics for Christ. We have perhaps the fastest growing recovery mutual aid group in the United States right now, which is Celebrate Recovery. And then we also have groups like JACS, and we have Maladi Islami. So we have specific faith-based frameworks of recovery initiation and maintenance. And then we have the traditional spiritual frameworks of the 12-step recovery groups and other such groups, such as the Red Road or the Red Road to Wellbriety. In those three dimensions, I should probably also note, the boundaries of those are somewhat diffuse, meaning that people may fit into one or more of those simultaneous categories. We have a situation where we have people attending Smart Recovery who also attend 12-step meetings, who attend NA meetings but also attend Celebrate Recovery. You have people that may start out in AA or NA and migrate towards Celebrate Recovery, or vice versa. So there's a high degree of fluidity across these boundaries. And we also have individuals who may shift those basic orientations at different stages of their recovery careers.
Bill, spirituality seems to be a common thread across many pathways. I know you and Ernie Kurtz have written on this subject. Anything you'd like to say?
The research that Ernie and I did as we looked at the role of spirituality in recovery initiation and maintenance really sort of clustered into three different kinds of experiences of spirituality that really transcend the secular, religious, and spiritual frameworks of recovery. And the first of those experiences was an experience of within, and that's a spiritual experience of the discovery of previously unknown or hidden sources of strength inside oneself. And there is this incredible sense of empowerment that comes out of that personal discovery. The second type of spiritual experience is really moves from that intrapersonal to interpersonal, which is really the experience of between. And it's really a connection with other individuals of shared experience, strength, and hope. It's a connection, often a connection with an experience of community. And then the third experience is really one of a transpersonal nature. And that is where individuals begin to experience resources outside of themselves, beyond themselves, and really beyond the immediate community. And these can be larger sort of rubrics of meaning in terms of life meaning and purpose, a reconstruction of values, mystical, religious experiences that really transcend, that give us this experience of transcendence as part of the recovery experience. Ernie also, in some of Ernie's early writings, also talked about these shared dimensions of recovery. And Ernie focused his early research on those dimensions within the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, but many of those are also shared across those boundaries of religious, secular, and spiritual. And the items that Ernie described there were such things as this experience of release, of having been almost enslaved and bound, and then this experience of breaking free. He talked about the experience of gratitude. He talked about tolerance and humility. And he talked about forgiveness. And finally, this experience of being at home. And by being at home, he sort of meant this growing comfort living within one's own skin, which was rare for people with severe, complex addiction histories during or even before their addiction history. And also that sense of being at home in terms of being comfortably nested within a community of one's own choosing. So I think those three broad dimensions, and I think the more specific dimensions that Ernie described, are part of this bundle of what we call the role of spirituality in recovery initiation and recovery maintenance.
Bill, how do people initiate or maintain their recovery?
You know, we have found significant differences in the level of help seeking that's involved in recovery initiation. The first of these is what we've called solo recovery. It also goes by names like natural recovery, spontaneous recovery or spontaneous change, auto remission. These are simply individuals who have developed severe alcohol and other drug problems, who then initiate recovery and maintain that recovery without significant resources outside themselves. We also note that the style of problem resolution here changes as problem severity increases. Solo recovery is probably actually the largest category of recovery initiation, but it tends to cluster in the lower to moderate problem severity range and with people who have substantial recovery capital, both at a personal, family, and community level. We also, as problem severity increases, we'll see an increased number of people who will reach out to other people in recovery to initiate and maintain their recovery. And of course, the classic examples we see with this are people who utilize the secular, spiritual, and religious recovery mutual aid groups as an ongoing source of support for recovery initiation and maintenance. And then we have a category of professional assistance. And that category goes from everything from people who may use the casual support of their primary care physician or the support of their clergy, or it may be people who are in counseling for marital problems or other problems who may initiate recovery and develop an awareness of the need for recovery within the context of these more general helping resources. And then as problem severity increases, we increase the likelihood that individuals are going to end up in the categorically segregated special care addiction treatment system in the United States. And these are individuals who will participate in a wide variety of modalities over time, from outpatient and inpatient, from psychosocial models to medication-assisted treatment and recovery support services. So in terms of varieties or pathways, we see a high degree of diversity in terms of the types of services needed and the quantity and duration of those services needed to initiate and maintain recovery. Again, primarily across the categories of problem severity and differences in recovery capital that people bring.
Bill, there seem to be some trends now in face-to-face and virtual recovery support. Any thoughts about that?
You know, I'm glad you asked that, Phil, because if there's a single shift that's underway right now, particularly in the peer assistance framework that's now moving into the professional assistance, it's this migration to what we're beginning to call virtual recovery. And this is the application of a whole range of new technologies to help people initiate and sustain recovery. I think we may see in some of your lifetimes a point where there are more people who participate in online recovery mutual aid support resources than are participating in face-to-face recovery mutual aid meetings. I think early on we thought, as Ernie and I began to study those, we thought that we would find that internet support groups would be an adjunct to face-to-face meetings. What we found to our surprise was a large number of people who were using those meetings to the exclusion of face-to-face meetings. We also found that the internet-based meetings were reaching new populations of individuals who weren't being well integrated into some of the face-to-face meetings. We found persons with disabilities were very attracted and obviously found those very accessible. We found youth very much drawn to recovery support meetings. We found people in remote and rural areas who didn't have access to face-to-face meetings increasingly participating in those meetings. We also found a very high percentage of online recovery support attracting women, and many women who would not feel particularly safe or comfortable going into a face-to-face meeting format. So I think there's going to be a wave of the future of a whole new level of recovery support that is really based on all of the new technologies of communication that we now have available to us.
Are there different relational styles in recovery? Do they fall into general categories?
I think there's at least one relational style that involves differences in whether people are relating to other people in recovery or not during their own recovery experiences. As I referenced with solo recovery, we have people that sort of have an acultural style of recovery. And what I mean by that is they initiate and sustain recovery without significant contact with other individuals in recovery, and in particular, without contact with the organized recovery communities that we have in the United States. Secondly, is we have a bicultural style of recovery of individuals who will initiate and sustain recovery with significant contact with recovery mutual aid communities and other people in recovery as a support for that, but also have significant continued participation in the larger culture. So they're bicultural in the sense that they've learned the core ideas and language and rituals and etiquette of the recovery community or a particular recovery community, but they're also very able to move out in the larger culture and function very well within that larger culture. And then thirdly, we have a category of individuals who developed a very enmeshed style of addiction recovery. And what that means is they initiate and maintain recovery almost exclusively within a recovery community, meaning their life is dominated by that recovery culture and people they know within that recovery culture and activities within that recovery culture, with very little contact with what they've come to think of as civilians or earth people or other such names for people without addiction and recovery experience. I think it's important to also know that those styles also relate to the kind of style of addiction that people experienced or interpersonally. People, for example, who were very enmeshed in cultures of addiction may need a very enmeshed style of addiction recovery, meaning that they go from a world of the drug culture to a world of the recovery culture. And they need to be as equally enmeshed within that recovery culture early in their recovery to fill that vacuum and void that otherwise would rapidly pull them back to active addiction. The other thing that is of note is that the styles may change over time. Many people will begin with an enmeshed style of recovery and then migrate towards a bicultural style as they begin to stabilize their recovery over time. And some may actually then move towards a more acultural style in late stages of recovery. And this is the story of Leanne Kaskudis and others who've studied individuals who initiated and maintained recovery for a period of time within a fellowship like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, but then disengaged and actually then maintained long-term recovery without contact with those. That idea of a disaffiliated style of recovery is interesting for this reason. We generally evaluate the effectiveness of a recovery mutual aid group based on the size of their active membership, and their ability to retain that membership. Now, in some of the secular recovery mutual aid groups, such as Smart Recovery or Women for Sobriety, people are not expected necessarily to have long-term affiliation. The idea is get in, use the resources you need, learn the skills, and then go on with your life. Whereas in 12-step communities, we generally suggested that we talk about prolonged, if not lifelong, affiliation with those. But it also suggests that if there is this larger pool of individuals, for example, who've attended AA or NA for a prolonged period of time, disengaged, and have continued to do well, then the impact of groups like AA and NA may be far greater in terms of its impact on the culture than we've historically given them credit for, simply based on their membership size at any point in time. So we do see these differences, these acultural, bicultural, and enmeshed styles of recovery that, again, may change over time.
People identify with their recoveries in different ways, too. What are those?
We found an interesting thing, and we stumbled on this inadvertently. For example, we wanted to do a recovery survey of people in recovery to measure the prevalence of it, for example, in the city of Philadelphia. So we thought, well, how do we ask this question in a public health survey? So we thought, well, if we ask people, were you once addicted to alcohol or other drugs, but today are in recovery, we would get a certain number of people who would respond to that question, right? They would identify with the language, addiction, or self-identify as an addict or an alcoholic, and self-identify as being in recovery. And we get a certain percentage of people that we ask that question of. But then we found if we asked the question differently, something interestingly happened. If we said, did you once have a significant problem with alcohol or other drugs in your life, but no longer have that problem? Then we got a significant increase in the number of people saying yes to that. And what that told us was there's a larger pool of individuals who actually would meet DSM-4 criteria for a substance use disorder, who do not identify with having that disorder, have resolved that disorder, but don't claim a recovery identity. In other words, they on paper, they are in recovery, but they don't claim a recovery identity. So we describe that as a sort of neutral recovery identity. Neutral in the sense of they're in recovery, they once had but no longer have this disorder, but they don't claim that recovery status. Secondly, is we have people with a very pro-recovery or very positive recovery identity. And these are individuals that you can bump into at the grocery store, and they'll tell you their recovery story in the aisles, between the bread and the bottled water. The recovery is very much a core sense of who they are now as a person. And then we have people who have a recovery neutral or negative identity. And the recovery negative identity is someone who clearly identifies as having been addicted, who clearly sees themselves as a person in recovery, but really experiences incredible discomfort and shame related to that status, and is extremely secretive of that. Not necessarily behind a tradition of anonymity, which is really about a spiritual tradition of humility and protection of the fellowship that one is a part of, but is much more secrecy around this sense of personal shame and discomfort if they disclose that status within their current social environment. So we see these three very different styles of identity related to recovery status. And again, those can change over time. With the growth of a recovery advocacy movement, it's very interesting because we're seeing some people, once very ashamed of that status, now beginning to see people and experience people standing up boldly, talking about personal recovery and what it's meant to them and their family and their community. And all of a sudden freeing them to begin to develop a very different sense of themselves as a person in recovery. And I think that's one of the major contributions of the current recovery advocacy movement, is freeing people not only from the drugs, but freeing people from the shame that was attached to the addiction to those drugs.
This concept of multiple pathways is gaining momentum. What do you think some of the implications are for addiction treatment?
I think for addiction treatment in particular, those implications are very profound. Historically, particularly through the 70s, 80s, and through much of the 90s, single pathway models of addiction treatment and recovery dominated the professional world of addiction treatment. Meaning that if you were in a therapeutic community, or if you were in methadone maintenance, or if you were in a Minnesota model 12-step recovery program, wherever you were at, you got a single portrayal of the etiology of addiction, the course of addiction. You got a single pathway model that basically said how one resolves these problems and how one maintains lifelong recovery. And the pathways were quite different depending on which treatment setting that you arrived in. The idea of multiple pathways of recovery is very provocative, because what it says is there are diverse pathways into the status of a substance use disorder. The course of those disorders are highly varied. They unfold in very, very different patterns in symptomology and different levels of severity and consequences. The treatment may need to be highly nuanced for those different pathways into, and that there are multiple pathways out of that condition. What the implication of that is people, as treatment programs, must move from program, quote unquote, meaning people come in and go through the program, to an ever expanding variety and menu of professional and peer recovery support services that are uniquely combined and sequenced and in time supplemented based on the needs of individuals. So you're going to have a much more individualized, a much more personalized future of addiction treatment based on this notion of multiple pathways. You're also going to have an increasing embrace of a philosophy of choice, which is very problematic historically within the addiction field, because we traditionally said things like your best thinking got you here and other such things, and your job is to shut up and basically do what you're told, and we will guide you through this process. It's a very authoritarian model of managing other people's recovery, whereas the concept of multiple pathways of recovery really means that our responsibility shifts from dictating a pathway to really becoming incredibly educated and informed and fluent about multiple pathways of recovery, helping people, educate people about what those options are for themselves and their families, and guiding them regardless of the path that they choose. It also means that if I'm a person in recovery working in this context, it means that I must become as fluent about alternative pathways of recovery as I am my own pathway of recovery, as opposed to programming everybody within the framework of my own personal experience. I think the other thing that it means is that we need, and this is very much underway right now, is we're beginning to shift addiction treatment in the United States from acute care models and palliative care models of treatment to models of sustained recovery management. And with that comes the idea of both integrating indigenous healers and peer recovery supports within the framework of these, particularly for people from diverse cultures, and also recognizing that if in fact there are multiple pathways of recovery, that those pathways are supported by different resources in the community, then as a treatment program we have a responsibility to reach out and develop relationship with those resources. So as opposed to a program having an affiliation with a single recovery support resource, it means we need to build relationships with a broad spectrum of those resources. We need to integrate peer recovery support services. We need to build relationships with the new recovery support institutions, the recovery community centers, the CCARs of the world, the recovery collegiate recovery programs and recovery high schools and recovery ministries. It means that the addiction treatment programs and professionals position themselves in a community in terms of their relationships in a very different way than we have historically. And most importantly, that in generally, we simply evidence our respect for these multiple pathways of recovery and develop a level of clinical humility related to our historical practice that allows us to continue to learn from those we serve about those pathways of long-term recovery and how they differ across cultural context.
Bill, what are the implications concerning multiple pathways for the new recovery advocacy movement?
Those implications are profound, Phil, and I think they've been profound since we came together in 2001 at the St. Paul Recovery Summit. When we met there, and out of which came Faces and Voices of Recovery and its collaboration with NCAD and Legal Action Center and other organizations to launch this larger recovery advocacy movement. It was critical to come up with some ideas that were different and separated it from earlier advocacy movements within the alcohol and drug problems arena. And we did start from the central position that recovery is a reality. That's what we wanted to say perhaps more than anything. But the second kinetic idea right behind that was an incredibly profound proclamation historically. And that was that there are multiple pathways of recovery and all are cause for celebration. That declaration broke down the historical divisions between 12-step groups and the secular recovery mutual aid groups and the religious groups and the professional treatment arena, and really forged a larger identity of people in recovery and families in recovery that simply allowed a situation where AA members could walk next to people in medication-assisted recovery, next to NA members, next to WFS and SOS and Life-Ring Secular Recovery, and on and on and on, and Smart Recovery members, marching not as members of those individual recovery societies, but simply marching as people in long-term recovery, celebrating the reality of recovery and the diversity of recovery pathways. What's emerging, I think, since then has been a growing ecumenical culture of recovery in the United States, celebrating this larger identity of people in recovery, forging a culture of recovery distinct from the culture of those individual recovery fellowships, with new recovery support institutions, such as the recovery community centers, recovery homes, recovery ministries, recovery cafes, recovery sports venues, et cetera, new recovery support roles such as the recovery coaches and the growth of peer recovery support services around the United States. I think we have yet to fully grasp what the emergence of this larger recovery culture will mean for that movement, and also what it'll mean for communities and the larger culture as a whole. My sense is that we are going to have a larger global movement towards health pushed by this recovery advocacy movement. And I think that will be healthy for very much healthy for people in recovery and families in recovery. But even more so, I think it's going to be really a healthy driving force within local communities as well.
Talk about recovery spaces, or I think the other term you've used is recovery landscapes.
Yeah, we tend to think of recovery as this very intrapersonal process, or a tight-knit interpersonal process within family in a close recovery support relationships. But here's what we've begun to understand. Imagine, for example, an adolescent who has been admitted for his 5th admission to inpatient substance use treatment. This adolescent is now an expert on that treatment, can do treatment very, very well, knows implicitly how to initiate recovery, can give lectures better than some of the counselors can at that particular treatment program. That adolescent does very, very well in his 5th treatment, as he did in his 4th, or as she did in her 3rd and 2nd. They are now discharged with this wonderful graduation ceremony, in which they are again given a ceremonial graduation chip and hugged and told to have a wonderful life as they return to the world of recovery in their community. They re-enter that community, having been institutionalized for the past 90 days. They wake up the next morning stir crazy to get out of this house. Where do they go? That's the question. Apart from any intrapersonal change they may have experienced, the question is there space within the community to support this young person as a person in recovery? And what we see repeatedly is that young person entering the life of this community in drug-saturated schools or drug-saturated neighborhoods, immediately drawn back to their past relationships, and those environments devour this adolescent and have them returning to drug use within a matter of hours or days, if not weeks. The question becomes, maybe it's time, rather than simply readmit this adolescent for a sixth treatment admission, that we go with that adolescent back into the life of their community and build the physical, psychological, social, and cultural space in that community where adolescents in recovery can survive by increasing the number of youth-oriented recovery support meetings, by increasing youth services within a recovery community center, building a recovery community center that serves youth, by increasing and building student assistance programs and recovery support groups within the schools. Those are examples of building space or building recovery landscapes within the community itself. And if we relate it to this concept of multiple pathways of recovery, is the question, do we have those diverse pathways of recovery supported within the life of a community? And in closing, let me just say one other group that I haven't mentioned yet. What about the individuals and families who are deeply grieving the loss of a partner or the loss of a family member due to addiction? What's recovery mean for them? And what are multiple pathways of recovery mean in the context of these deeply wounded families? I think where we're going to be going is to learn more about those families and their grief and their experience, and also what recovery means in the context of that kind of loss. And building the space in the community and inviting those families into the larger recovery movement and advocacy movements to join with us to help them both heal and also give meaning to their loss through recovery advocacy and peer support for other families in similar circumstances.
Bill, I was fascinated and intrigued, captivated the entire time. Do you have any closing thoughts?
I think my closing thoughts would be that we're going to continue to see moving away from this hardening of the categories, if you will, and working in these silos, and really beginning to create a larger recovery community across these diverse varieties of recovery experience and pathways of recovery. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to, as we move forward, we're going to make sure that we assure representation across those pathways, both in our recovery community organizations, and also that those recovery pathways are reflected within the professional organizations and the understanding of those pathways in those. I think the other thing is I wish I was 30 to be able to live what's going to be coming in these coming decades, because to see what's unfolded in the past 20 years and the incredible discoveries that are emerging out of this growing varieties of recovery experience and what we're learning from them. It would be wonderful to be a fly on the wall and simply be able to watch all of this unfold from decades to come. But it has been a real privilege to be part of it and to bring it this far. So, if I was going to say anything in closing, it would just be that I really wish everyone here Godspeed on your journey into that future. And I feel so pleased that many of you are going to be carrying the legacies of some of us old-timers forward. So thank you for that in advance.
Thank you, Bill. It's been a privilege.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Phil. Good to see you as always.